In the last lecture, we saw that tacit consent didn't work very well as far as justifying our obligations to even fairly decent sorts of government. We said, though, that perhaps if it wasn't tacit consent, that implied consent might provide a solution. What's implied consent? Well, implied consent can be one of three things, but they're all fairly related things. It could be that an act may lead us to conclude that a person would have consented had they been asked. So if you consider the behavior of most Americans with respect to their government, you might think that they would consent if they'd been asked. It just so happens that they wouldn't ask, or it just so happens that nobody has asked, but if they had been asked, they would have consented, and so they're bound just like if they had consented. A second, slightly stronger version of implied consent might be that an act or a statement may in fact logically commit us to consenting. That is to say, it would be irrational or stupid to do or say something and then refuse to consent to government. So an example here might be if someone came out and said, I love the United States. The United States is fantastic. It's the best place to live on earth. Man, am I glad to live here. And then a person went on and refused to consent to the authority of the United States government. It seems that those sorts of statements logically commit you to consenting when asked. A third thing that implied consent might be is that an act may be such that it binds us just like consent would bind us. It would be wrong not to consent given the act committed. So not that it would be irrational, but it would be actually wrong not to consent. So I like the example of crossing a border into another country. Not, blindfolded in the boot of a car, but I mean actually voluntarily taking the train or the plane and crossing a border. Well, when you do that, you are very much aware that you are changing jurisdictions and that the laws are going to change. And so in that sense, by the very act of voluntarily crossing the border, seems to commit you to abide by the rules and regulations in place where you're landing. Just similarly as to when you go to somebody else's house, you're aware that you are not in your own house anymore, you're in somebody else's house, and so different house rules might apply. Okay, so implied consent, all these three definitions involve acts or utterances that people might make that don't amount to explicit consent, but they nonetheless strongly suggest that a person would consent. So as I said, implied consent really helps explain why foreigners are consenting to the laws of the land when they travel, even if they never sign a form saying, I consent to the laws of the land when they walk in, or they're even asked to consent. The act of crossing a border, combined with certain stipulations, like it's voluntary, that they're aware of crossing the border, seems like consent. It seems very much equivalent to consent. So, in this lecture, I want to examine two popular cases of what people often refer to as implied consent to government: residence and voting. Most people think that either choosing to continue residing in a country or choosing to participate in a country's political institutions counts as consenting to be governed by those very institutions. So when people vote, or when people choose to live in a country, they thereby acquire obligations very much akin to as if they had consented. You might even say it would be wrong for them to refuse to obey the laws once they've done those things. So let's talk about continued residence. Locke himself says that if you reside in a country and enjoy its public goods, then you're tacitly consenting to be governed by its state, but really what you're doing is you're implying your consent. We could reasonably infer your consent. Now, like we said last time, it's definitely not tacit consent. For there to be tacit consent, there has to be an obvious choice situation when you know how long it's going to be before your non-consent no longer counts. And there's just no obvious choice situation. It's really not clear when non-consent will be appropriate, and it's not clear, this is not about consent, it's more about reciprocity, but it's certainly not clear that you're enjoying the benefits of living in the United States means that you consent to be ruled. After all, when people give you gifts, that doesn't give them the right to rule you or command you. Gift giving does not give people that power. Otherwise, Christmas would be a lot more fraught with tension. So, is it implied consent? Well, maybe, maybe not. For one, we can infer a lot of things from consent. From residence, not consent. We can infer lots of things from residence other than consent. We can infer that people don't have any options. So when we look at the citizens of North Korea, for example, it's just not clear that in fact, it's pretty clear that their residence does not imply consent because they're not allowed to leave. They're often shot if they try to leave. So, what about the United States? Well, in the United States, they don't shoot you if you try to leave, but note that it's very, very hard to surrender your passport, and it's very, very, and then for most people, it's rather difficult to move abroad. It's not easy. We could also infer oppression from residence. Again, not so much in the United States, although you might think that certain kinds of economic or structural conditions amount to oppression. So for those people who see economic situations as being coercive, so Marxists are like this, for example, you might think that being born in an inner city environment in the United States with with little access to schools and very few options, it might be that the fact that you're in those conditions doesn't mean that you're consenting. It means that you have no options again. And finally, a lot of people just aren't very political. They don't think about these things. I'd say most people don't go around thinking, man, if I buy this house here, that's going to commit me to consenting to everything the government does. It's just not how most people think, and most people's continued residence, therefore, doesn't mean that they're aware of a consent situation. It just means that they're going about their lives doing their thing. And so their unthinking habit just doesn't seem to commit them to consenting to anything. Furthermore, choosing not to reside in the country, that is to say, to emigrate, seems to violate our conditions for any kind of consent to being valid. That is to say, emigration seems like a very costly way of showing you don't consent. Right? I mean, refer back to our archetypal situation of the meeting, where someone says, if someone says, raise your hand now, that's a low-cost way of signaling your non-consent. But if someone says, move to another country, or you consent, well, that just seems really unreasonable. And so, signaling non-consent by immigration is just really difficult. And also, the consequences of immigration are really bad. They're not just inconvenient, right? For most people, they're disastrous. It seems like it would be wrong for the state to make you choose between consenting to its rules and living with your friends, family, and so on and so forth. That seems more like a threat. It seems more like extortion or blackmail than giving you an option or a choice that you can freely assume. It seems more like the case of the drowning guy, Jim, where instead of Jack rescuing him, it's the U.S. federal government rescuing him, coming along and saying, well, we will, you can either go and live in Antarctica or hope that some other country's going to want you, or you can consent to giving us this percentage of your income and obeying all our rules. And for a lot of people who don't have thin accounts of consent, that seems a little bit unreasonable. But again, opinions will differ, I think. If you have a thin account of consent, you might be fine with that. Okay, what about voting? What about participation in government? Would it be wrong to think that by voting or participating in government, you implicitly consent to being governed? And so participating in government can be more than just voting, but a lot of people focus on voting. But lobbying, running for office, wouldn't all these things signify that ultimately you consent to be ruled by the outcome because you're participating in the process? And this, I think leans heavily on the metaphor of fair play. That is to say, if you participate in a game, you're bound by the rules of the game. You don't have to participate in the game, but if you do participate in the game, you're bound by its outcome. So, if you choose to play poker, or if you choose to play the lottery, or whatever, you're consenting to abide by the rules of those games. I think that this is a much harder case than the residence. I think residence, if you have a thin enough account of consent, residence can work. But participation in elections in particular just don't seem like they imply your consent to be ruled. For instance, let's say that you would like the government to be more legitimate than it is. You would like the government to, say, ask people to consent. Well, you could vote in the government, you could vote in an election precisely in order to make the government more legitimate. You're not conceding that the government's legitimate, you're trying to reform the government. So you're protesting a kind of tyranny, perhaps. Or you could be, again, trying to defend yourself in various ways from a predatory government that happens to let you vote. And this is maybe not as obvious in the United States, but you can think about countries where elections are only dubiously free and fair. You might think of Iran, right, where there are free elections with competitive parties, but none of the parties can, can say certain things against the ayatollahs and the religious infrastructure of the country. So there's a kind of there's a public space where people can debate certain things, but not other things, right? Well, voting in that kind of election mean that you consent to the whole government of Iran? Well, probably not. People who are voting in those elections might be trying to reform the government to try and expand the space of issues that can be discussed in the public sphere. And so, it's just not clear that in that case, voting counts as consent. And if it's not clear in that case, maybe it's not so clear in our case either. Right? I mean, you could imagine a certain kind of system where your ballots actually say your votes mean you consent. And it might be generally known that if you don't vote, then you consent to whatever the outcome might be. But even then, I think it's a little bit difficult. I mean, if you think about voting, what people say about voting counting as consent, they'll say, well, if you vote and you get the outcome you want, then of course you're bound to agree. You got what you wanted. If you vote and you don't get the outcome you want, well, you participated, right? So you must agree. So you must be bound by the outcome. You participate in the game, just like if you play poker and you lose, well, you've got to surrender your money. If you play the election game and you lose, well, you've got to abide by the outcome until the next election. And if you don't participate, people say, well, you've just forfeited your right to make a decision, and so you're still bound, right? But note that if no matter what you do, you can't not consent, well, it doesn't sound like that's a good way of signaling. If there's no means to signal non-consent, then it seems like a rigged game. It seems like there's no way that that process could secure your consent. So it seems to me that there has to be an option for you to say no before any kind of mechanism can secure your consent. And it just doesn't seem like those who see participation as consent, it just doesn't seem that they provide you with an out. Generally the out is, well, then you can leave. But then it's not participation doing the work, it's residence, right? If the option is, because then it just doesn't sound like it's the election doing any of the work, it's the residence itself that's doing the work. And so, again, I just don't see participation as being a very good way of signaling consent. So, it seems hard to make consent theory work. It seems that we want consent in areas where our central interests are at stake and where people's acquiescence is really important. I mean, again, think of the areas where consent plays the most important part in most of our lives. We're making various kinds of long-term contracts, particularly marriage, or intimate ones, like when we're getting intimate with other people. That's where consent really, really matters. And we can imagine cases where tacit consent and implied consent could play a role, but we don't want to expand those cases too much. We want there to be fairly stringent conditions on, when consent is genuinely and freely given, and avoid cases of exploitation. And there's no reason for me to think that government is any less weighty a kind of engagement than the situation we just mentioned. And so, it seems that for a government to have legitimacy, to have the right to rule, the state needs to make the non-consent alternative sufficiently painless. There needs to be a reasonable non-consent, a reasonable way of dissenting and of opting out of commands. And first of all, it's just not clear that that's feasible. And if it were feasible, it's not clear that it would be desirable to have a whole bunch of people running around not under the authority of any state. And so it's just not clear that any state can actually do that, can actually make consent viable. In other words, it just seems like the state is more of a non-consensual kind of affair, right? consent theory, again, to me seems to rely on norms that are not consent to do the work in binding. That is to say, it's that you reside there, but you also accept the benefits. Or it's that you play the game, and therefore you're bound by the outcome. Well, both of those things aren't really consent. They're more an appeal to fairness or appeals to reciprocity, which we talked about earlier in the course. So why make the theory about consent? I mean, I know consent's attractive, and it's intuitive, but it just seems like most of our best consent theories are ultimately relying on other things than consent to bind people to governments and political institutions. I mean, the way I look at it, I mean, it's certainly plausible to think that you have a duty to obey decent sorts of governments who happen to be in your neighborhood. And maybe consent can add something to that. That is to say that if you do actually consent, then you're especially bound. But it seems to me, nonetheless, that if you don't do your fair share in maintaining the conditions necessary for your own survival and your own success, your own flourishing, then you're just doing something wrong, right? If you're not doing your fair share, you're probably just doing something wrong. And so institutions that maintain those conditions, conditions for your own survival and flourishing, have earned in some way your allegiance. But there's not really a contract here. The contract is purely metaphorical. It's a model, maybe, for understanding reciprocal relationship, but it's not really a contract. I mean, you do things for them, they do things for you, but it's not really a voluntary arrangement. At the end of the day, we realize that opting out is not feasible, or even desirable, really. And because most people can't leave, and because if you were to refuse, that really wouldn't mean anything as far as your obligations or as far as what was enforced upon you. Yeah, it just doesn't seem to be the case that the state-citizenship relationship is usefully modeled as a voluntary one.